checking in on the conversations that we had in December when we kicked this off. But otherwise, today is going to start our work session together. We're going to re-ground ourselves in the specific charges that this subcommittee was given by legislation. And I'm going to talk a bit through the timeline we have to accomplish that. Because while it sounds like we've got plenty of time when we talk about doing our work by December, there's a lot of factors in between. So I'll walk through that in just a minute. But what I'd like to do first is go around and do a combination of introductions so everybody remembers who else is on the phone, as well as any reflections or just thoughts that you had stepping away from our December meeting. I know there's been a little bit of things between now and then, from the holidays and a new year to this little Arctic freeze we got. But would love to just hear what people thought, whether it was an idea that stood out to you or just a feeling you had about this group or a question you had. So again, as we did with our last meeting, I'm going to ask two things. One, if you're a member of this subcommittee and you're in a place where it's safe and comfortable to do so, that you have your camera on. I understand some people may find themselves traveling or multitasking, and certainly appreciate that. If you're a member of the public joining at some point, we do ask that you leave your camera off. We will have time for public comment at the end. The second thing I'll ask is so that everybody knows who's speaking, both the people on the phone and those who may be watching the stream of this, that when you speak, you simply say who it is that's speaking so everybody knows. With that, and I'll try to tee up people so you know a couple folks in advance, I'm going to go in the order of my screen to start with, which will be Nshanda and then Karen Bigelow. Would love for you to just introduce yourself. And if you had any takeaways or reflections from our December meeting, feel free to share those.
This is Chanda, Executive Director for the Chanda Center for Health. I really appreciated the first meeting. I think that there were, we definitely have an amazing group here, and the reflection that I took from that is I feel like we have a pretty broad awareness and understanding of some of the things that we all are experiencing in our individual lives, and definitely bringing them towards this to address them in a much more systemic way. And so that was my reflection.
Thank you, Chen. I'm going to go to Karen and then Shannon. And while I make that transition, I also want to welcome Lieutenant Governor Primavera, who is making time to join as many of these meetings as she can. So thank you, Lieutenant Governor, for being here. But Karen and then Shannon, please.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. My name is Karen Bigelow. I'm the Mayor Pro Tem for the City of Thornton, and so excited to be a part of this group. I think we have a really dynamic group in terms of a broad variety of types of disabilities that we can all speak to. And that was my takeaway, that I'm just excited to get going.
I appreciate that. Shannon and then Craig.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shannon Callahan. Reflection from last meeting. A lot of thoughts, that night and everything, and just a lot of ideas and a lot of about how, so many things we're not individual, but how we all have some similar struggles and issues that are coming up, and then how we can make that into one statement. So just trying to think that through, and we'll see what we get with the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm going to go to Craig and then Kylie, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Craig. I'm the community organizer with the Center for People with Disabilities. And yeah, I agree with what everyone has been saying. I think what we're talking about, really, there's a broad scope to the work that we're starting here. And we do have a lot of amazing, diverse perspectives all contributing. So I think it's going to be really exciting to focus on and see what we can create that's tangible to affect change. So looking forward to starting the work.
Thank you, Craig. I'm going to go to Kylie and then Rob and then Lieutenant Governor. I don't know if you're in a place you'd like to say hello, but I'll get to you if you'd like to after we introduce the members. Kylie and then Rob.
Thank you. This is Kylie Shalmaful speaking. After our last meeting, I was just impressed at the wide variety of experiences we had too, and just felt like I have a lot to learn, which was exciting and a little overwhelming.
Thanks, Kylie. Rob?
Hi, Rob Hernandez speaking from the city of Colorado Springs, and it's going to be interesting to see how this pans out and what we're going to be able to do to come bring our minds together on how we can make things better for the community, the disability community. Looking forward to it. Really exciting. I mean, this is what I do and what I live for. It's a passion, and I just can't wait to see what good comes out of this.
Thanks, Rob. Lieutenant Governor, I know you had a full schedule this afternoon. Are you in a place where you can say hello?
Yes, I can say hello. I just wanted to tell everyone that I agree with Kylie in terms of the expertise that's on this subcommittee. Technically, by statute, I'm not really a member, so I'm in a listening mode. And I've got a lot to learn also, even though I've been in the field for decades. But anyway, I just want to thank everybody I know everybody's got real jobs, and this is an addition to a real job. So thanks for your passion and thanks for your support. And I'm looking forward to what we can accomplish.
Thank you, ma'am. And I think everybody knows how committed the Lieutenant Governor and her entire team are to this process and these issues. She's also joined by her senior policy advisor, Josh Winkler, who's on the line and is going to be listening into a lot of these calls. Coming out of the December meeting, and a few of you alluded to this, there was a lot. We have a big scope, and it would be very easy, in fact, for us to see that scope creep and expand. So the first thing I want to do is reground us in what's going on with the overall task force, and in particular with this subcommittee. As you probably recall from our December conversation, there are in fact 4 subcommittees of this task force that are each tasked with doing specific pieces of work as it relates to the rights of Coloradans with disabilities. We have one working on a rewrite of the law, and they're looking specifically at whether there's pieces of law governing the rights and the remedies related to people with disabilities and what may need to be rewritten there. We have another subcommittee that is looking very specifically at housing, including access to housing for people with disabilities. We have a third subcommittee that is looking at issues around outdoor recreation and whether it's in the public or private sector, what does access to all of Colorado's recreation opportunities look like? Ours is within the government subcommittee. And so I want to reground us, and you'll see on the agenda that we sent around really the 4 areas. One is about accessing government services. One is around the ability to participate in public discussions. The third is around employment in government agencies. And the fourth is running for and serving in public office. So those are the areas that we really want to focus our work in. And that leads me to talk about what is the scope of work. And I see the Lieutenant Governor with her hand up. She may be correcting me on this. Lieutenant Governor, jump in, please.
No, I'm certainly not correcting you, Barry. You did a great job. I had a question though. I had asked a member that goes to my gym to be part of this subcommittee, not this one, but one of the subcommittees. And there is a subcommittee on outdoor recreation, and there's also a subcommittee on government. And it just so happens that the gym that I go to is run by the city and county of Broomfield. So I would assume that gyms and recreation centers and all those things, they're not outdoor recreation, but they are indoor recreation. And I just wondered if that's something that the government subcommittee just might put in their thinking caps on about, I don't know if Thornton has a recreation center or not, but it seems like accessibility for recreation centers might be something that this group might want to think about.
I think that's a great point. And in fact, today, part of what we're going to do is brainstorm a bit within each of those 4 categories. And I think there would be a clear case to be made that if it's a recreation center run by a local government, that's going to fall under access to services. I'm not here to tell you what does or doesn't fit in. I'm here to share what the legislation tells us, and we'll dig into that. But appreciate you flagging that, because we don't want something important like that to fall between the cracks because somebody said, oh, well, the other subcommittee should have, or neither of us should. So I will invite everybody to be ambitious with how you interpret things. And that brings us to what our work and our timeline and scope of work is, because we are here to deliver a report with recommendations to the primary task force or the executive committee of the task force. So what I can tell you from my experience with these different working groups, nobody is going to raise the bar higher than what you all do. Nobody's going to say That's a good idea, but let's make it bigger. So I would encourage all of you to be as aspirational and forward thinking as possible. And we'll pass those recommendations on to that task force, and they're then going to consider those. That brings me to my next point of what is our timeline. Our obligation as a subcommittee, as set forward in the statute, is to deliver a report of our recommendations on those 4 categories I mentioned and that we'll walk through by December 1st of this year. Again, that may seem like, well, we're talking a year away, but if we backwards map having our final report on December 1st, we've probably got a month or so of revisions and fine tuning that. The other thing I will put on the table for discussion, and it's nothing we have to make an absolute decision about today, is the legislative process. Often the governor presents his budget a month before we're talking about delivering our report. At that same time, and even sooner, legislators are doing what's called pulling their bill titles. So they're identifying what are the 5 pieces of legislation they intend to introduce. All of that to say, to the extent that we know where our recommendations are going, and if they carry any fiscal note or any cost, the sooner we can get those to the governor and the lieutenant governor and to members of the legislature, the more likely it is that they can do something about it in the January to May 2025 legislation session. That's not to say that is our only goal. Our objective should be to do the most comprehensive and effective work that we can. And if that means that we're working up until November 30th, and my team is working overnight to deliver the report on December 1st, we will do that. I just want to raise that as we kind of backwards map our work. Our thinking right now, and we want to be fluid and responsive to all of you, is that each of these 4 topics I mentioned, access to services, ability to participate in public discussion, employment in government agencies, and running for and serving in public office, each warrant at least one dedicated meeting and conversation. So if we map those out as our February, our March, our April, and our May meetings, we may want to also have time for new topics that you all identify, which could easily be our June meeting. And then maybe we're workshopping them and how to bring them all together. And suddenly we're in July and August. And I bring all of this up not to intimidate people or make you think that we should limit the work that we do, but rather we're going to need to be very intentional and structured and stay on the topics we need to address to be able to do the best job that we can on all of those. I would also expect that after one comprehensive meeting, for example, about participating in public discussion, you may tell me after we have our conversation about running for office that you had more ideas going back to our discussion of services or public discussions or even employment. So we want to build in time and support you the best we can to make sure no conversation is cut off short and no new ideas are limited because of the schedule for these meetings. So before I start opening it up, and we're going to start going through each of these topics to lay out an initial brainstorming list, does anybody have questions about the scope of work for this subcommittee or how our work fits into the rest of the task force? I'm not seeing any hands, and I hope people feel comfortable. This is a small group. There will be times where I will call on everybody because I want to make sure we have everybody's ideas. But as thoughts come to your mind, feel free to either raise your hand using the emoticon to physically wave it at me, or just come off mute and lean into the conversation. I don't want this to feel like an overly structured conversation. But not seeing or hearing any questions about our scope of work or timeline, what I want to do is spend about 10 to 15 minutes, or however much we need, on each of these topics. And my question for everybody is going to be, what does this scope mean to you? For example, when I say we are to make recommendations around access to running for and serving in public office, what types of things does that bring to mind for you? Is it things like the ability for somebody to get on a ballot by petitioning? Is it about the primary process? Is it about how people cast their ballots? And again, when I say things like this is not at all me suggesting things. I'm just trying to get the discussion started. And the first topic we're going to go into is access to government services. And I'm sorry, Karen, did you have a question for me?
I was actually going to start giving ideas, but I'll wait until we get started. Sorry.
Okay, no, please. I appreciate the enthusiasm on it. The first one may seem a little wonkier, and that is around accessing to government services. And what the legislation says, I'm going to read this, is that the purpose of this subcommittee is to study and make recommendations on issues to ensure people with disabilities have access to the services they need, are able to effectively participate in public discussion, are able to be employed by government agencies, and can run for and effectively serve in elected positions. Our charge is to make recommendations in each of those 4 categories. So I'm going to open it up on the first one, which may seem a little wonkier, but access to government services. And this one, I am going to go around the room, and I'm going to go in reverse order. So that means going by my screen, which will be Rob and then Kylie. And my question first to you, Rob, is what are the things that come to mind for you when you think about people being able to access government services, whether that's what it means to access them or what types of services or any specific things you've seen out there that we need to make sure we include in that discussion?
Rob Hernandez here. So that's a broad question with a lot of answers. The way I look at it is what we're doing at the city. When the law said the law already exists, Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I guess we have to decide how further we're going to take that. But the thing is, when we say access, you have to be able to have access to everything that the government provides to the public. So if there's a service that the government's providing to the public, that means web accessibility. That means if you're going to have a meeting, you have to take into account if somebody is in a wheelchair, can they access that meeting? Is there parking? Is there path of travel? Is there a proper entrance? Service counters, restrooms, in some cases, elevators. It's very broad. The public right of way, you're talking pedestrian ramps, sidewalk that's wide enough. Right now, the law is 36 inches, but with the PROAG, which is the public right of way accessible guide, that's going to change here shortly to 4 feet, with the best practice of 5 feet. Really, it's everything. In other words, whatever a person with a non-disability is able to participate in that the government is offering, somebody with a disability should be able to participate in. I don't care if that's a concert, surfing the web, a job, which is under Title II or Title I of the ADA. It's everything. If you go to a medical appointment, depending on your disability, is there an exam table that's proper for somebody with a disability? In communication, you're talking effective communication. Is there, if you're hard of hearing, is there a looping system? If you're deaf, is the ASL being provided? If you're using something as simple as a telephone, video phone, which is the newer version of TTY. Yeah, and captioning, it goes on.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate that and really appreciate all the work that you're doing. Just because you mentioned the ADA, I do want to, weigh in and share with you a bit of the conversation that the Rewrite Subcommittee is having. And to be very clear, I am not here to give you advice, and I'm not here offering legal advice. What I want to share is that the Rewrite Subcommittee has been looking at things, for example, where Colorado's CADA or our local laws, state laws, reference the ADA. So for example, our statute says that a person with disability is as defined in the ADA. And some of the discussions that group is having is whether or not that's sufficient. Or should we, because of any risk of federal law changing or going away, they've been discussing things like incorporating directly into Colorado statute some of those requirements. Again, this is not me offering you legal or policy advice, but I want us to think about those things as we go forward and what extent we want to make sure things are covered in our own law. And particularly, we want to be brainstorming, Rob, like you've just started laying out for us, the long list of things that we want to make sure are included when we say access. Rob, I'm going to stay with you. I see your hand back up, and then I'm going to go to Kylie.
Rob Hernandez here. Yeah, that's a great, that's really a good point. So a good example of that you made me think of right away is I remember getting a call from a person who was quadriplegic, and he said he was having a hard time using the restroom and getting into certain areas at this facility at the county. And I had inspected that facility and it had met ADA compliance. So I was a little confused. So I decided to meet with him so that he can explain and show. When I met with him, I saw that he was quadriplegic. So then I thought, okay, well, how's he even going to open the restroom door? How is he going to get into this area over here if he doesn't have the use of his hands? So that's where, even though the county was meeting the ADA, was that sufficient for that individual to be able to live or to function? It was not. So we had to go above the ADA, and I took it to the commissioner. I says, hey, we need to make these restrooms beyond that. So I installed door openers at a certain level within the ADA, but also functional for him, and then some other areas. So that was the solution there. And that's just one example. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that, Rob. And we've heard members of other subcommittees repeatedly say that the ADA needs to be the floor, not the ceiling on what we do for Colorado. I'm going to go to Kylie and then Craig with this question of, when I say access to all government services, what are the types of things that brings to mind, both in terms of what services and what accessing them means?
This is Kylie speaking. So I work with human services. So what comes to mind for me is more like human services programs like TANF, food stamps, childcare programs, and making sure that those are accessible through the application process, through the physical buildings. I also think about courts, since I am a lawyer and I'm in court most days. And so I think about making sure that our hearings are accessible as well.
Thank you, Kylie. I'm going to go to Craig and then Shannon.
Hello, everyone. This is Craig. When I think of access to government services, a whole bunch of things pops into my head because the term access to me is so broad. I think of everything with the very general access as just having access to information, to are we doing enough to get the information about the services to the vulnerable communities that need those services. And I feel like there's a lot of disconnect in that messaging, and the networks that are in tune with people with disabilities aren't necessarily utilized, and people aren't getting the message as clearly as they could. So I think from an access standpoint, just access to information and also access to education about these services and who they are, and also creating that trust between the government body that's providing the services and the communities that are receiving them, and understanding that there needs to be a trust with those two communities in order for them to be used appropriately and as intended. And then furthermore, with access, I think about digital accessibility, and I think about not only the ADA, but I think about the website accessible guidelines that exist now and are continuing to evolve, but they're not really as enforceable or standardized as other parts of the ADA. So I think that's something that could be looked into and made more mandatory on a lot of sites. And I know that's something that even on a lot of our city and county and state government websites right now, they're still not screen reader compatible, and the information isn't provided in plain text formats or simplified text formats. So a lot of that, and this is just very underlying things that need to happen before any service can even be performed. And then also understanding the importance of having hybrid options for these services, knowing that transportation is a huge barrier within our community, and that needs to be understood a little bit more clearly about how large of a barrier that is. And a really good example of that has to do with the COVID-19 mass vaccine clinics that were popping up when we were going through that. And if there wasn't a transportation plan in place, you didn't have access to that service, which was life-saving and essential. So I think that's a part of the puzzle that also needs to really be looked at with all government services. And then again, tech literacy and digital divide, how we're presenting this information, where there's an assumption that there's an underlying knowledge and education about how to use Zoom or how to fill out an online application through Google Forms without thinking about the end user and if they have the underlying knowledge set to be able to use those tools that we're sharing. And then I also think with access to government services, to really be inclusive, we have to have a really clear and transparent way for individuals to report discrimination or to report things that aren't working correctly, so that when the services aren't working as intended, there's a way for people to let the people in charge know that something needs to be fixed without fear of retribution or being targeted for anything.
Thanks, Craig.
Yeah, there's a few more.
Yep,
Thank you.
and we will be coming back to this, and I will forewarn as you listen to folks, my next question on this topic is going to be, so who do you need to hear from? What do you need to learn? What research do we need? In just a second, I'm going to go to Shannon and then Karen, but I see the Lieutenant Governor with her hand up.
Well, thanks, Barry. And I'm really not on this committee, so I ought to just mind my own business. But I had a couple of things. It's not only the services that the government provides, but I would think contracted services. You know, if we contract to have an event somewhere and things like that, we got to make sure that, you know, they're accessible. And then Chris Hines isn't on the call today, but maybe offline, Barrick, you could talk to him. I think I learned something recently that, and I think I'm correct, and I don't know, maybe Craig could correct me if I'm wrong. A lift is not a lift is not a lift. And so maybe a manual wheelchair, the lift could handle the weight of it, but perhaps a electric or power wheelchair is heavier, and maybe a lift could not handle the weight. So I think making sure that, you know, just because they have a lift doesn't necessarily mean they're accessible, but I could be wrong. And I don't know, maybe Craig wants to chime in.
Appreciate that, Craig. I'm going to give you a quick chance if you wanted to respond, and then I want to get Shannon followed by Karen in.
Yes, thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. This is Craig speaking, and you're exactly correct. I don't know the details about different lifts, but I think that speaks more broadly to having a clear and unified definition of accessibility and what we mean by that. And when we say something is accessible, what does that mean? And I think we could ask everyone what that means, and we would get a different answer in some respect. So I think it's really important for us to really get in sync with the definitions of what we're putting into the scope of work. So when we say accessibility and we talk about physical or digital or anything, we'll know exactly what we're referring to and what that incorporates, so that when we say accessible lift, we know what that is referring to and what types of wheelchairs that it encompasses, to make sure that it's truly bringing access to as many people as possible. So I think really just clear definitions is a really big part of where we need to start before we can have the broader conversation.
Thank you, Craig. Shannon, to you with the question of, when I say access to government services, what does that bring to mind for you in terms of what services? How do you think of services? And what does being able to access them mean we need to be talking about?
Okay, great. Hi, Shannon here. Well, I have a question too before we go on. I know that you mentioned you're going to collect all the recommendations and everything. And my question is for you, Barrick, is there any limit to like our budget or anything? I mean, can we just put in any ideas as we want, or do we have to do like prioritize them to one and making sure that, you know, we can invest our, I just want to make sure if we're investing our time to one recommendation, or we can to make that happen, or can we, go to 3 or 4, or is there a limit? That's one thing I wanted to ask, if that can happen before I just want that question answered first.
I appreciate you asking that, Shannon. My best advice to this group is to think big, to think boldly. I would not want you to say, don't recommend that because maybe they won't spend money on it. I would say, let's put as many ideas together. Let's set all of those ideas as the North Star. As we put them together, we may decide to prioritize, to say, if you do nothing else, do these 5 things. If you can do everything, do all 20 of these things. So please think of this as, let's put all of the good ideas on the table. Let's make the recommendations that would make Colorado the best place in all aspects.
Okay, great. This is Shannon here. Thank you. Okay. So my interpretation when we're talking about accessibility, I think the problem is, and I know we talked about this, we have the ADA. ADA is the minimum, and it becomes more of a ravine for people like, okay, here's a problem. And it's a lot of paperwork, and it's just a lot of paperwork we have to solve. And I'll fix this one thing, and then just these little tiny things that keep piling up and piling up. So my topic when it's accessibility is more proactive instead of reactive. So if we can do more than just the normal, more than just what the ADA says we can do, more than that's a good investment, because we have people have work orders, and every time there's a work order, maybe every 6 months, then they have to fix something, and then that just eats up the government's ability to fix things. So I want us to focus on more, like large things, more things. For example, as a deaf person, I require access to interpreters. So meetings, it's usually 2 weeks advance that I can't, I have to have 2 weeks advance to have interpreters. There's a minimum cost to interpreters. If it's a last minute, if I have to go to a different event, or if they're at a hotel, we got to say, hey, we ask you to get the interpreter. We have to ask the different events. And I'm always the one having to do the work. And it should be the government where I show up and they have the access right there already. You've already been, you knew I was coming. And they've already done their all research and everything, but instead I have to do it. Say, hey, I want to go to this event. I have to get this interpreter. I have to contact all this. So how, I think it'd be, how often is this problem a problem for us? I mean, this is often, do we, is it something that's happening? Can we meet, how often does someone meet a deaf person, or how, maybe a blind person? And maybe they don't meet a lot, but they still should have access, as like Rob said. You have that access and apply it to general, maybe it's people without a disability. You can still apply access to them because maybe they need the same things and both can benefit. Like captions, for example, anyone can benefit from captions. So accessibility to government services should not only be a department or agency, but a person, if they need some things to improve, if you want to talk about improvements and just act on them instead of saying, no, let's wait until a situation happens and then be reactive instead of being proactive and saying how we approach this and how, because that's one thing I noticed that the government is, we are never, and I don't understand why we're waiting until a problem shows up. That's one thing I never understand.
I appreciate that, Shannon. And as I get ready to go to Karen, I want to emphasize to everybody, today is this initial brainstorming. As we get into these ideas, please don't limit your thinking to law. It's not that our only recommendations are going to be change this law, change this rule. We also have been invited to make recommendations of best practices. So Shannon, to your point, we may make one recommendation that says the law says you must do this. The best practice is to do this times 5. So I want to leave that all open. Rob, I see your hand up. I still want to get to Karen and Chanda. Did you have something directly responsive to what we were just talking about? All right, let me jump you in real quick, and then I want to get to Karen and Chanda.
Okay, I'll make Rob Hernandez here. Make it real quick. Shannon has a very good point. So, typically what we do is request an ASL interpreter within 48 hours. It gives us the opportunity to try to get one there. But here's the thing. Sometimes we're not able to secure one because the company that we're dealing with doesn't have one available. but that's not meeting the maximum extent feasible. So why don't we get creative and let's say VRI? Granted, VRI, video remote interpreting, is not the same, but you still took that step beyond because you couldn't get an interpreter live. You can use the VRI to at least meet that requirement and not just leave the person hanging there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Let me bring in Karen and then Chanda. And Karen and Chanda, to reground us, when I say we're to make recommendations ensuring Coloradans with disabilities have access to all government services, what does either of those things mean? The services, what's the scope of that? Or what does having access and being able to access mean to you?
So I just have to say, Shannon specifically, we literally had this happen Saturday. Our city council was interviewing for a brand new planning commission, and a woman showed up who was hearing impaired. She didn't even have the right questions that they had given her beforehand. We did not have an ASL interpreter. She was able to read lips well enough, but it was inexcusable, in my opinion. And we need to provide those services. So I think at city council meetings, we don't provide those services. And we certainly need to ask people that are coming in to interview for boards and commissions or anything else for that matter, contacting the city in any way, shape, or form, right? We need to make sure that they understand if you need these services, we have them. So that's one of them for me. A second one is that we still have sidewalks in part of our city that are not ADA compliant for wheelchairs. And then speaking to what the lieutenant governor was talking about earlier in terms of rec centers. Our rec centers may be ADA compliant. However, we do not offer transportation within the city for people who might be in a wheelchair and not be able to drive themselves over to the rec center. So I would say transportation's an issue.
Thank you, Karen. Chanda, bring us home with this for this conversation. When I say services or when I say access to them, what does that bring to mind for you?
This is Chanda. For me, I prioritize my certain categorizing. So for me, I'm kind of looking at like, I would like to know where, our list of services that's covered, right, for long-term support services. So I instantly think of like our community, there are services. What are those services? And then I also outlining the benefits of those services. So I'm thinking of everything, right, that's covered underneath there. Like, are the hours or the units of those services adequate? If they're not, like identifying the barrier, identifying the solution to that barrier, noting that, like you had mentioned, ADA versus regulatory, right? Colorado versus federal. I think that really understanding all of our government services, the benefits, those very specific details, knowing that we as in the community are very aware of prioritizing some of those that are constantly an issue that are causing barriers to access everyday services. Because I know that, again, I come from the healthcare perspective. And so for me, while I look at all of those things, I know that every component in which government services to us is to, one, enrich in our lives, and without really identifying all of them, understanding their benefits, and then outlining the barriers and solutions. I think those are that, I feel like that's kind of a tactical way of looking at our services, and knowing and communicating those barriers. And then when it comes to access, given there's a variety of those services, for me, I feel like access is going to be, not so standard, but standard in the sense that there are some very basic things that we need in order to access any service that's provided to us by the government. But I also then feel as though there are some very specific, more detailed interpretation that is being, that needs to be more specific rather than interpreted. I feel like oftentimes we're going into our services where, that's the interpretation of the law, or that's the interpretation of the ADA, or that's the interpretation, but yet there's really no teeth to drive the detail and the output of like what's really the responsibility of it, and to then monitor and make sure that those are they're being, you know, addressed appropriately. So mine's a little bit more tactical, but yet at the same time, accessibility on all of those pieces are essential, from accessing the building to communication we just talked about. And so that's what comes to mind for me.
Great, thank you. I am going to move us on to the next area of topics we are tasked with looking into. What I want to ask everybody, though, is that as we continue all of these conversations, make notes to yourself about what types of things you would like to learn, who you would like to hear from, what research you would like us to bring to support all of you as we go into the conversations about each of these topics. What we are going to do today is go through this conversation about the 4 topics and then identify which one we are going to start with at our next conversation. That next conversation will involve really getting deep into what are the issues, and we'll be asking you in advance what types of research you're going to need to support that. But Craig, I will tee up. I'm going to go to you first and then over to Kylie. Now we're going to talk about our charge to ensure the ability to participate in public discussion. And I think we all know public discussion can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different settings. So I want to ask each person, when I say, again, the ability to participate in public discussion, my 2 questions. What types of public discussion does that bring to mind for you? And what does it mean for the state to ensure the ability of all Coloradans, particularly the rights of persons with disabilities, to participate in those public discussions? So Craig, to you first, and then to Kylie.
Hi, everyone. This is Craig. Yeah, I was thinking about this one, and public discussion is, again, a very broad term, but I think about an opportunity for people with disabilities to voice their needs, concerns, demands to people that hold positions of power, whether that be representatives, legislators, city council members, school boards, committee hearings, providing testimony. Any kind of form like that is where I first think of for public discussion, and town halls. And again, all of what we spoke about previously comes into play here with the physical accessibility and access to the materials that are being discussed, and making sure that there's multiple formats available of the items and topics being discussed, and making sure that there are hybrid options for participation so that individuals that have transportation barriers or are homebound are able to still participate despite not being able to be there physically and in person, not having that be a barrier. And then also increasing visibility of people with disabilities in these public forums. And we have to really dismantle a lot of the stigma that exists around our community. And that can definitely be a barrier for people with disabilities to want to participate publicly because of the stigmatization of our community. And we see that through ableism, and especially through ageism in the public discourse, and kind of referring to us as less than. And also there's a stigmatization and criminalization of people with disabilities through criminalizing mental health. So all of these factors make it really difficult and hard for people with disabilities to want to be in these public spaces where they're open to ridicule and being that up against all of these stigmas that are built in to enable a society. So I think in order to increase participation in public discussions, we need to make the spaces feel safer for our community members. And these underlying issues need to be addressed in some way through education, through trainings, through increased visibility, to try and help make these public spaces feel more safe and comfortable for our community members, for us to expect increased participation. It's not, in my mind, not only about do I have transportation to get there? And can I use the restroom because I'm a wheelchair user? Of course, those are all great things, but do I feel safe to speak up? Or do I feel like there's going to be a spotlight put on me that's going to expose myself to more ridicule and more barriers because of that? So I think, yeah, I need to think about that more specifically. That's all kind of broad, but that's right where my thought process kind of jumped to.
No, I appreciate that. And I know this is kind of putting everybody on the spot cold. This is really just to get the conversation going and start identifying some topics. We're going to have time to give you notice in advance to do some thinking and to really drill deep into all of these. But Craig, I want to appreciate you bringing up both the strategic or technical things, like what the format is. Is it in person? Is it hybrid? How accessible is it? And the softer side of it, the cultural things and how people behave that makes it feel welcoming. And this is where we do have opportunity to both say what you must do and here's what you should do in terms of best practices. Kylie, let me go to you and then Rob. Craig kicked us off. When I say participate in public discussions, what are these public discussions to you and what does it mean to make it accessible for people to participate?
This is Kylie speaking. I would echo a lot of the things that Craig already mentioned in terms of town halls, legislative testimony, and city council meetings. I think I also think about online forums. So whether that is government pages or social media accounts or how we're getting information out about these discussions.
Thanks, Kylie. I'm going to go to Rob and then up to Chanda.
Rob Hernandez, speaking. You know, that's really kind of what I said before. When you're talking about public discussion, well, you got to think about how can a person participate, and that can get into ASL interpreter, captioning. So, like for instance, our council meetings that we have at the city, we have captioning. But in some cases, sometimes we have an individual that wants an ASL interpreter and they should have that right. And we do so in that situation. We also have the chamber looped for persons that are hard of hearing so that they can use their hearing aid with the looping system. And then there's virtual meetings, like Kylie said, making sure that we provide captioning during the situation in a meeting and ASL if requested. That's like right here, we have ASL. So yeah, we just have to look at that, take that universal approach, inclusion all the way around. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Let me go to Chanda and then Karen and then Shannon on this one.
This is Chanda. I would say I don't have very much to add outside of what has been already expressed. I do think that if we're going to show up in space that is remotely, I think that's one that we need to ensure that, definitely all the interpretation in terms of visual, hearing, all those components. I think the just making that more robust if that's the space that we're going to show up. I think that being mindful of also as we show up in physical space together that we're being mindful of the same accommodations that we would do virtually, but obviously within physical space. It's very, very interesting how many times I'm sure all of us have been invited to spaces where they didn't think about wheelchair accessibility, they didn't think about ASL, there's various things that we're not thinking about. And I feel like the more that we can ensure that inclusivity in terms of disability is always present in those spaces, that's when we're going to start to be seeing a lot more success and participation. Otherwise, again, we just constantly see it as a barrier. And I think most of us that are pretty, strong advocates, we're going to still show up, but that does mean that those that don't have this strong this advocacy presence to them, they give up and don't show up. And so I think that the more that we're going to make that ability for everyone, it allows for that opportunity to be actualized. And so that's my only added piece.
Thanks, Chanda. Karen and then Shannon. What's public discussion and what does it mean we need to talk about when we talk about making sure there's access?
Honestly, I think everything that I brought up already and that Rob has mentioned is exactly what I would have said already.
Fair enough, and we may have a few of those. Shannon,
Yeah.
When I say everybody should be able to participate in all public discussion, what is the scope of public discussion? What does that mean? And what does it mean to have access?
Sure. Yeah, so this is Shannon. You've all provided some incredible examples. I do have some to add. Obviously, a safe space. Many of you mentioned that being able to show up if you don't have access, or maybe there's a lot of loud people screaming or something like that. You need to have a safe space where people can go and feel like they have time, that they can have those healthy discussions, ask questions, be involved if they don't understand a word, rather than, oftentimes spaces you feel very rushed, time is limited, and you don't feel like you had enough time. You don't feel like you really were able to assimilate into that experience. In terms of expectations of how meetings are run, being able to ask people, have the schedule, the time, what we want to talk about and things like that, so that people kind of expect that those are some of the things that are going to come up. Like last year we had a town hall, and it was assumed that people would show up, and when they did, there was no interpreter, there was no access, so it was a waste of time driving into that. So I just kind of showed up and I was like, okay, cool, I can't be involved here, and I left. So that's something that, like I said, I couldn't help out, I couldn't chime in, so I left. So that's something where a meeting was being run and access was not included in the meeting itself. So that's why I'm coming back to that topic of having a safe space. Should we have that kind of discussion for people with disabilities to be able to have more time and have more flexibility in terms of being involved in those kind of discussions? Just a thought.
Thank you, Shannon. The next one shifts the conversation a little bit. And our next area of inquiry is ensuring the ability and the rights to employment in government agencies. And so I'll leave to you, it's been suggested that that's pretty straightforward what we mean when we say the ability to be employed, because employed you either are or are not. But what are the types of issues that it means to have access and to be able to be employed and to have that opportunity across the board? And actually, Shannon, since you just spoke, I'm going to stick with you and go back around the other way. So I'm going to go to Shannon and then Karen. What are the conversations we need to have? The things we need to consider to ensure that Coloradans with disabilities have the ability and the right to be employed in government agencies? What are some of those considerations we should be talking about?
Sure. Yeah, this is Shannon again. So one thing I'm thinking about in terms of employment is providing what needs to be met so that the person can do the work throughout the day, to be able to work in government. And not just that, but people need to understand that people with disabilities, obviously they do see lots of barriers, and they see those things. It could be physical, it could be mental, it could be a communication barrier or things like that, but they're also still very intelligent. There's high and low functioning people. And often, in terms of employment with the government, people just think automatically, oh, that person's disabled, they don't have the ability to do this, they can't do it, they're just going to be struggling. So providing access, being able to make sure that those people are able to do their jobs, and that they're actually given the jobs, that they're hired by the government in the first place. So often, from what I've seen, is people tend to they'll be like, okay, great, you're hired, you can work with us. And then all of a sudden that becomes, they're the token. That's tokenism. So they hire that person just because, so that they can say, yes, we do have a person with a disability working here. And so we need to reframe, that of course, yeah, that person can do that job. And also you need to actually give them, you know, everything that they need. It's not just to save some money for the government and again have that tokenism happening. Um, we need to make sure that that person has a fair opportunity to be able to do that work and has everything that they need to be able to do that.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm going to go to Karen and then Chanda. When I say employment in governmental agencies, not to develop the recommendations as we sit here today, but what are the types of topics we need to discuss and need to be on the table to ensure that?
So one of the things that comes to mind for me is every time you apply for a job, you get asked, do you have a disability? And I've always wanted to know from an HR professional, if you say yes, does that count against you in the process? And so I think that's a question we need to be asking. How do people trust that if they answer that question truthfully, that they still have an equal opportunity to get that position?
Thanks, Karen.
Mhm.
Chanda, and then to Rob, and then Craig.
For me, it's, working with folks with more high level physical disabilities. I think that our state has actually done a pretty amazing job with work incentive programs, for without many of us adults with disabilities would not probably be doing what we're doing in some capacity, because there for a while you've always had to really identify whether the income would take you over the limit for your benefits not to be available to you. So that's that was a little bit intertwined, right? But I think that as it looks at in terms of government employment, I think that oftentimes the question for me is, to what extent do advocates that maybe join those particular employment opportunities can lose sight of the advocate component, right? And so I think that we need to have more folks with disabilities in government positions, but then I also find that oftentimes we don't go there because then we lose the lens of fighting for true justice, because we now have to fall within this other. So it's kind of, there's this catch-22, and I think that's been the hardest piece, I think, for a lot of us within the disability community to navigate and understand. How can we remain both, going in with both lenses?
Thank you, Chanda. I'm going to go to Rob, and then Craig, and then Kylie with these same questions of, we're not trying to answer it today, but I do want to make sure we start sketching out what are the conversations we need to be having? What are the issues we need to consider when it comes to ensuring the right and the ability to be employed in government agencies?
Hi, Robert Hernandez. So I think within whether it's a corporation or a government job, I think we need to start with education and training. And what I mean by that is educating our employees what with the potential of that a person with a disability or the ability that a person with a disability might have. I mean, you got to look at them as being they're no different. If anything, it's just like anybody. This person might have more ability than this person in certain things. And just because they have a disability doesn't mean that they know less. And if anything, they might know more. And they have to take that disability out of it and look at what is the ability of the person. That's what we need to look at, the ability of the person, and educate our employees that everybody has abilities. and hire the person because of their ability. And look at the fact that, okay, granted, you hire this person, you might have to bring reasonable accommodations so that they can perform their duties. Okay, but we got to get out of that little silo and start teaching our employees that everybody inclusion, we all have great ideas, and together we can have a great team. If that makes sense?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rob. Craig, and then Kylie.
This is Craig. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I really agree with what everyone is saying, and especially agree with Shannon and Karen and Rob all talking about this culture shift that is essential in taking place and starting at the hiring place and making kind of a culture of inclusion. And definitely, Rob, what you were referring to is we need to really put more of an emphasis on valuing lived experience of people with disabilities and valuing diverse perspectives and learning how that's a value add to organizations and not a negative. And that happens through a culture shift, and that can be kind of shifted through requiring disability etiquette trainings for all staff members, just to create that culture of inclusion. I think also it's really important to have updated and comprehensive non-discrimination policies that incorporate reasonable accommodation processes. And these aren't just best practices, but something that's enforceable and built in that can be required, and that there is action if it's not done. Because reasonable accommodation, everyone gets reasonable accommodations. People have chairs and but it's only a reasonable accommodation if you need something outside of the norm. So we need to think about who's deciding what's reasonable and what's not. And that happens through a culture shift to make everyone feel inclusive. And then also a big one that I think is definitely a barrier and can take away from valuing lived experiences is stop having such a strong requirement on the education requirements, and the paper ceiling being a very real thing, and that being a large barrier to employment for a lot of people. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. Kylie, your thoughts.
I don't think I have anything that hasn't been added. I think everyone has kind of covered what I was thinking and gone deeper, to be honest.
Great. Quite all right. I know it when we have 6 or 7 people ahead of you who have offered such comprehensive thoughts, it can be a little bit of overload, but we'll have plenty of time. And if any of you are like me, you get off the call an hour later, you're sitting down and having dinner and saying, you know what I should have said. I hope you'll write that down. And I hope you'll either send that to me in an email or hold on to that and make a note of it for the next meeting. We have one more topic to get through, and then we'll use the last of our time to talk about stakeholder engagement. The next one, though, is running for and serving in public office. This one may get a little more complex. What does it mean, and what are the barriers? What types of things do we need to look at in that entire sequence and continuum from deciding to run for office to serving in office? And what are the issues or topics within that spectrum and continuum that we need to ensure every Coloradan, and particularly Coloradans with disabilities, have the right and the ability to do? Shanda, you're once again in the top of my screen, which for good or bad means I'm going to you first. I'm going to go to Shanda and then Karen, followed by Shannon.
This is Chanda. Very similar to the employment piece. I think that it's just identifying how do we, transition folks that are very much in advocacy into the ability to run for office. One of the things I do think of within our community as well is that oftentimes, running a campaign, raising dollars around that, I think sometimes that level of concern might come up for folks with disabilities, especially when it's how, if I'm going to be raising money and it's going to be counted towards a level of income, but yet I'm not on the buy-in program. Like there's all of these various like income components that might cause for somebody to not identify that they want to run for office because it somehow might penalize their access to government services and benefits. So I'm not quite sure how prevalent that concern or barrier is. I know then once somebody makes that decision, then having accessibility to the various components of our, government buildings, especially the Capitol, we know that just, within this year, Ortiz was able to get things accessible, but that hadn't been done until now. And we know that Chris Hines had to pull himself from the wheelchair up to a stage. And so those are very looking at in the 21st century that we're still having levels of conversation around accessibility in our government buildings is a little bit disheartening. And I think that those are the primary concerns that come up for me that I think can have some really strong recommendations for resolution to make sure that folks with disabilities are in a place of power and influence, because I think that we're not seeing enough people with disabilities in those spaces. And I know oftentimes like I'll still be going to women's conferences that are healthcare, and I'm the only one with a disability visible, let's say, in the room. And so I think that the more we're getting to a place where disability is not something that we're willing to hide anymore, which is really great. And so that's my comment.
Thank you, Chanda. Karen and then Shannon. What do we need to be talking about to make sure everybody can run for and serve in office?
We need to also be talking about accessibility during campaigns. I think I brought it up at the very first meeting, where when you're running for local office, you have to knock doors. And so for someone that's in a wheelchair, that's impossible to do because most houses have steps to get up to the front door. Plus, you're not just dealing with single family residences, you're dealing with apartment buildings, condos, etc. So I want to say, how do we make that fair and accessible for everyone? Secondly, if they're in office, yeah, Shanda's right. Most of these buildings are not ADA compliant, not just at the Capitol, but I believe that happened at Denver City Council this year as well. Even in Thornton, where I'm at, we have such a horrible old lift that really needs updating to make somebody feel, that would help make somebody feel comfortable. And even when you're serving on council, you're getting up and down a lot to take photos, etc. There's not room for someone in a wheelchair to move around, to get in and out. So I would say there's going to be a lot of updating that needs to happen in order to make that better for people to run and serve. And then again, as we talked about earlier, just ASL, we need to provide the ASL, we need to provide the captioning, etc.
Thank you, Karen. Shannon and then Kylie. What are the topics we need to talk about if we're going to make recommendations both for policy as well as for best practices to ensure everybody can run for office and serve in office?
Great, Shannon here. It's funny because you asked that because, I have been thinking also about running for a political office myself in the past. But there's a lot of barriers because you think about, I can't do this and how would I do certain things? What would I buy this from? Who's going to pay certain things? I mean, do I have to do tax? Do I have to fill out tax? There's a lot of gray areas and confusion with what do you do? What's the process? What's allowed? What's not allowed? And also, like everyone's mentioned before, different access in there, access to buildings. Why is that meeting taking place in that certain building where it's not accessible? And why not over here and going and knocking on doors? It's not accessible. I mean, me, I might lose votes because they can't talk to me because I'm a deaf person. And, if I can't knock on doors and everything. And is there a neutral place we can come to instead where there's actually a platform and there's actually a place you can do face to face that's more accessible? And then also, before you want to help and you want to give people, or is there places to give access and to give equal access? I think the question it's just not understanding exactly what to do to run for office. I think there's a lot of gray areas and a lot of confusion of what is and what isn't allowed and what can we answer and what can we do. And then people could maybe understand like, oh, I could be able to do this. I'm motivated to run for office. But right now people are scared because they're like, there's all these things I don't have an answer, and I don't have the answers for either. So I think that's where people, they want to run, but they're kind of like not sure what to do. And I think if that we could solve that, then maybe that would open some doors there.
Thanks, Shannon. And I hope it doesn't end up deterring you from serving in any capacity. I think it's gonna be great to have your ideas here to make sure that is a possibility. Let's go to Kylie and then Rob and then Craig. What do we need to be talking about? What needs to be on the table in terms of rules, laws, or best practices?
This is Kylie. I don't think I have anything that hasn't been said already.
Totally fair. Rob and then Craig.
Rob Hernandez here. Well, that's I think that this one here is probably one of the more challenging ones. Once somebody gets into office, there's lots of things that could be done. You could put a looping system in, you could put a lift in, a ramp in. There's things to be said there because it's, providing a reasonable accommodation. But I think the challenge is getting elected. How do you run for office? Campaigning. I think that's where we need to put our minds as how do we get that? There's commercials that we can work on, and let the public know this is who I am, right? And coincidentally, I have a disability, but this is who I am, and educating them that way. But the other thing is, going door to door. So maybe Shannon, you have a ASL interpreter going with you door to door, and again, this is who I am. Maybe have a flyer. This is who I am. I'm deaf, and blah blah blah. And you have your interpreter, and you strike a dialogue there, conversation with the person you're trying to, you're trying to get their vote. And then there's areas where you can't get to their. Karen had a good point. She was talking about there's a lot of homes with steps, so maybe get creative there. How do we go? How do we approach that? Do we carry a portable ramp? Because there's portable ramps. That might be one option. But I think, I've had to deal with this stuff, believe it or not. And you really got to get creative here. That's where great minds come together and think of things, how we can do this. But I think the campaigning, man, that's a tough one. We got to really put our minds together. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. Craig.
This is Craig. Yeah, I think a lot of what I was thinking has been said. It's when I think about the first steps of running for office, the first place I go to is where do I start? And I think more clear and transparent information about how to start that process. And then also a lot of talk about just inaccessibility of not only the process, but of fundraising expectations and how to run a campaign definitely disproportionately affects people with disabilities and creates many more barriers in the process. But I think also paying people a livable wage to hold these positions of power is really important, because if it's a job that takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of external things that doesn't pay a living wage, people that need to have a second job or to live aren't going to be able to be in these positions, therefore reserving it only the people that have more money and resources and assets. And that's not a way to kind of get diverse perspectives and people with disabilities holding this position of power. So I think we need to really show that we value people with disabilities and incentivize us to hold these positions by paying us for our time and showing that we're valued and not have to have a second job if we want to run for office, because everything we do is more expensive than the norm. So it's essential for us to, it to be worth our while, or else we'll say, well, we have rent to pay or hold this office. And the decision's really easy to make if you're forced to make one. So I think that's really important. And then in addition, just everything everyone else said, really good stuff.
Thank you, Craig. As you've probably noticed, I took this conversation a little bit longer. I'm sorry, Shannon, please. See your hand up.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll just make it quick. Just wanted to add something. Craig, thank you so much for bringing that up. For example, a lot of times with interpreters, the cost can be between $45 or even $75 an hour. So the question is, who's going to pay it? Personally, I can't afford that. For a whole entire day to have access to an interpreter, that's cost prohibitive. So where does that cost come from? Does the government pay for that? So again, that's a question where, there needs to be, it needs to be designed into the program where, is the interpreter, is that a separate cost, or where does that cost come from, and everything like that. It needs to be in there. We need to have a process for that where it makes sense, so we don't have that struggle of, if an interpreter needs to be called in, where's that money coming from? So that's all I wanted to chime in about.
Thank you for adding that into it. I was just going to say, I took this conversation a little bit longer than we had planned on the agenda, in part because I see that we have no members of the public, so I was able to use the time we had set aside for public comment. I also wanted to allow everybody to weigh in this heavily. The last thing we have to talk about is stakeholder engagement. We are going to, after this meeting, dig into all of your comments and send out to you a proposal for the sequence with which we will address these issues. What I will need to ask is that in advance of our next meeting, where we start really digging into one of these issues, that you respond to our email or jump on the phone with us and give us your suggestions for the type of research, readings, or conversations that would be most helpful to you. I also want to note to everybody, it was flagged to me that Representative Ortiz is carrying some legislation this session on this last topic we've been talking about access to elections. This doesn't go the full spectrum of everything you've all been talking about, but it does speak to the ability to access the ballot, and states in the draft legislation that I've seen that simply the petition process would not be sufficient. And the legislation would also call for accessibility to things like the caucus and party assemblies, with ideas like video conferencing or other accessibility options. As soon as I've got a clean copy of that bill, we'll circulate that. I'm just bringing it up so you're all aware, and so you know that the team supported by the folks at DORA and the Civil Rights Division is very much tracking everything going on. So we'll get that out to you. As I mentioned at the last meeting, and I'm going to bring Carrie, my colleague, in now, stakeholder engagement is going to be critical to our process. We are grateful for all of you giving your time. We also know that 8 people in one meeting doesn't speak for everybody in the state. So one of the things we're going to be asking you in the months ahead is to help us identify other individuals, organizations, and constituencies who we can engage to get additional input on all of these topics. We'll also want to work with you to, just as we are committed to making the state do, to making sure that our work is accessible. So we'll want to talk to you about not only who we should talk to, but how do we make those conversations easy, convenient, and accessible for everybody. Carrie, I'm going to ask you to jump in to talk a little bit about this. What my ask is going to be at the end is that you come to our next meeting with your first lists of people that we should be talking to. And whether that is talk to John Smith, or whether that is talk to people with visible or physical disabilities who live in rural Colorado and tell me to go find those people, any of that is acceptable. I just want you to bring to us the lists of the people or the roles of people or organizations we should speak to. Carrie, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the platforms we're going to use?
Yep, sure thing. In addition to what Barrick was talking about there, about you guys sharing specific names of individuals or organizations that you would like to hear from or who you think should be featured as part of this subcommittee. Dora has come up with a specific stakeholder engagement tool that is really going to help expand our universe of stakeholders that we're able to engage. And I'm just going to real quick, if I can, share my screen with you. Let me see if this works. Yep. Here we go. Can you guys see this screen here? Welcome to Engage Dora. Great. This is actually going to be a dedicated web page for our specific this government subcommittee. There will be a specific page for each subcommittee going forward, but this is where Katie over at Dora is helping us put this page together. I'm just going to give you a preview. For example, the Homeowners' Rights Task Force that has been put together. This page will be dedicated to the government subcommittee of this task force. We will be able, it's going to be useful, I hope, for all of you also, where you'll be able to see some key dates and upcoming information. You'll be able to share and revisit meeting recordings. But one of the things that we're most excited about is the ability to intake stories. So if you wanted to be able to share a link to an organization or an individual who you feel like has a story to tell, whether they want to keep it internal to just this task force or make it a public story, this is how we're going to be able to engage a really broad swath of people in this process, which is really important to get out and beyond just this this group of folks individually here. So we'll be able to get stories from individuals. We can create surveys if there is specific information that you guys want to dig into more in depth. But wanted you guys to know, you can go to engagedora.org. Katie and I will probably have the government subcommittee page live probably in the next 24 hours. But if you wanted to go on and just check out the capability of what this engagement tool will be able to do for us, feel free to do so. I'll share it with you also in a link as soon as we have it live. But it'll be really good because you'll also be able to look at what the other subcommittees have going on in some of those stories and inputs that we'll be getting from other involved stakeholders as well. So that's happening. Just wanted you guys to know that that resource is coming to you in the next day or so, and we will share more information on how we can get this out to the public. It's going to be particularly impactful because we can share a link out into, we could put it on Nextdoor and be able to get into individual communities and zip codes to hear from, you know, folks we may not have direct access to in smaller rural communities with city council buildings that need updating to be more accessible to those with disabilities. So going to be a really great tool. I hope you guys all find it useful and it does have an impact on your thought process going forward. That's it. Back to you, Barrick.
Thank you very much, Carrie. With that, if I can get you to stop sharing that screen. So there we go. We can see everybody. We are ready to wrap up in just the next few minutes. I want to go over a couple of the next steps so you know what to expect from us, and then open it up if anybody has any closing questions. As I said, our team is going to huddle and get with the team at the state and talk through which of these topics we want to tackle first. What I said at the top of the meeting will hold true. We'll have one dedicated meeting to each of these 4 topics. And at the end of each of those, we'll talk about whether we need a second dedicated meeting or where they may want to intersect. Once we've gone through all 4 sets of conversations, we'll bring them all together and make sure that everything intersects, complements one another, and we'll see where we want to make recommendations in all of the different types, whether those are policies, whether those are government actions, whether those are best practices that you want to recommend to the task force. So we'll get that all out to you in the next couple of weeks, well in advance of our next meeting. At our next meeting, I will ask you to come to that conversation with thoughts about stakeholders, and we will email you a couple weeks ahead of that meeting to ask, given the topic, if there are specific experts, types of research or information that would be helpful to support your conversations. That's where we're going to go next, and Carrie will be following up, provide some more links so you can take a look at the stakeholder engagement and understand how we're going to start to use that. But in these last few minutes, does anybody have any questions about today's conversation or how we're planning to approach the next 6 to 9 minutes? I'm going to go first to Shannon and then to Craig.
Okay, yeah, so this is Shannon. I'm just curious about with the data. I don't know if we're allowed to ask the state agencies to provide the data. Is that something that we need to ask through you to have that formal process go the way it's supposed to? I'm just not really sure which route to go with that one.
That would be one of those types of things that, yes, please let us know what would be useful. I can't sit here and promise how robust of data they will be able to present, how quickly, but we will make every request that you guys make to us.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Did I see Craig with a hand up?
Yes, this is Craig. So I didn't have a question, but as we were talking about stakeholder engagement, I was wondering if I could recommend we go on a subcommittee field trip. On March 7th is Disability Rights Advocacy Day, and that's a day hosted by Representative Ortiz and CCDC and other disability rights organizations and stakeholders at the state capitol. And it will involve a rally, an opportunity to speak with legislators, and speaking opportunities, and lots of members of the disability community will be there. And it'd be a great opportunity to go and see the Capitol firsthand and experience the accessibility challenges at the state capitol, as well as an opportunity to speak directly to the disability community about issues of government being there on an advocacy day. So I think that could be a good opportunity to kind of have some in-person firsthand experience with our community members and direct engagement. And it happens to be on the same day as one of our meetings is scheduled. So if it stays that way, I'll be unable to make it on March 7th because of that scheduling conflict. But I think it'd be great for everyone on this call to experience this event and be there in person.
So a couple of quick responses. Number one, I'm going to own and apologize to you that I signed off scheduling a meeting on that day and wasn't aware that that day was taking place. We'll follow up with all of you and see if we do want to talk as a group about rescheduling that. I want to respect that opportunity. On the idea of a field trip, full transparency, I'm going to have to talk to the state to see if we can make it an official field trip, or if that carries some implications. I may not be authorized to decide those things. That said, I would love to be there, and I would be happy to make sure that all of you have the information about that. So we will get that information from Representative Ortiz, and I will make sure that's circulated. We'll also follow up, Craig, about whether all of you would like to find an alternative time for that one particular meeting, because that's obviously an important opportunity and an oversight on my part. So thank you. With that, seeing no questions, and we are at 5:01. Thank you for the bonus 60 seconds. I know it's probably coming up on dinner time or picking up kids' time, or at least just calling it a day because it's finally above 30 for the first time. Thank you all for your time today. We will follow up by email as we talked about today. You also have Carrie's and my email. Feel free to email us anytime. We're always happy to chat. Otherwise, have a great evening, a great rest of your week, and we'll look forward to connecting by email and seeing you again online in a month. Thanks all.